On February 7, 1984, President Reagan announced the withdrawal of American troops from Lebanon, and shortly after, America's partners, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom also withdrew their forces from Beirut, leaving Amin Gemayel and his government to the mercy of Hafez al-Assad and his proxies. Druze and Shia militias took control of all southern routes out of Beirut, cutting the capital off from the presidential palace in Babda. The palace would be besieged by Sunni militias, and on February 17th, President Gemayel agreed to abrogate the accords with Israel, with the Lebanese parliament officially doing so on March 4th. And with Amin Gemayel thoroughly subjugated, Assad did what he had done many times before throughout the Civil War and call for another reconciliation conference. Well, the delegates met and they couldn't come to any agreement on political reforms that could end the Civil War. And the Americans were also not done fighting in Lebanon, despite the fact that they had pulled out in February. State-sponsored terrorism had by 1980 become a weapon of unconventional war against the democracies of the West, taking advantage of their openness and building on political hostility toward them. The hurried withdrawal of Marines from Beirut in February 1984 left a clear message: terrorism works. And when terrorism works, one consequence is assured: far more lies ahead. After the death of Bob Ames in the embassy bombing of 1983, the CIA sent in Bill Buckley to rebuild U.S. intelligence operations in Lebanon. But on March 16, 1984, a month after the withdrawal of U.S. forces, he is abducted by members of Hezbollah. Back in Langley, they feared not only for his physical well-being, but also for the classified information he had getting into the hands of terrorists and their backers. They had turned the systematic kidnapping and torture of innocent Americans into an instrument of war that was meant to persuade us to abandon our policies in the Middle East. I learned, as had President Carter, how helpless the head of the most powerful nation on earth can feel when it comes to the seemingly simple task of trying to find and bring home an American citizen held against his will in a distant land. On top of the growing trend of foreigners getting kidnapped in Lebanon, the CIA had all of its other Cold War operations to keep on track, including the arming and funding of the Contra rebel group in Nicaragua, which ran out of funds in early 1984, and Congress had forbidden the CIA from diverting additional funds or from asking third parties to fund their ventures in Latin America. CIA Director Bill Casey felt personally responsible for Buckley's kidnapping and was considering all options available to free him. Over the next 2 years, these two tasks would morph into one. Reagan was preoccupied with the fate of the hostages and could not understand why CIA could not locate and rescue them. He put more and more pressure on Casey to find them. Reagan's brand of pressure was hard to resist. No loud words or harsh indictments, none of the style of Johnson or Nixon. Just a quizzical look, a suggestion of pain, and then the request: we just have to get those people out. Repeated nearly daily, week after week, month after month. Implicit was the accusation: what the hell kind of intelligence agency are you running if you can't find and rescue these Americans? If Hezbollah believed someone they kidnapped was working for a foreign intelligence agency, they would be interrogated and tortured. And for their safe return, they would make outlandish demands, such as getting Israel to release 1,000 or more prisoners in exchange for a single non-Israeli intelligence official, knowing the Western powers would never acquiesce to it. But Hezbollah never intended to release these captives, especially after they had tortured them. Doing so would have given proof to the West of their inhumane practices, which could isolate the group internationally, making it harder for them to operate abroad. The US suffered another car bombing on September 20th, hitting its new embassy in East Jerusalem, killing 8 people. One of Hezbollah's front groups, the Islamic Jihad organization, took credit for the attack. The terrorists had trained at the Sheikh Abdullah Barracks, which housed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in the Bekaa Valley. The attack was done in response to the US vetoing a UN resolution condemning Israeli policy in South Lebanon. The kidnappings would continue throughout the rest of the 1980s, but for the people of Lebanon, they were merely background noise in the ongoing civil war. On April 9, 1984, a ceasefire between all of the Lebanese factions was declared. Amin Gemayel would visit Damascus, and upon return, he inexplicably began supporting the Lebanese National Movement's proposals from the Reconciliation Conference back in March. But the Lebanese forces rejected these reforms until it succumbed to pressure from the Gemayel family. The ceasefire allowed the army to begin clearing up roadblocks in West Beirut and repairing the international airport. The army attempted to enter the Shuf, but the Druze militia refused to let them in. President Gemayel wanted to consolidate his position and disarm the Muslim and Druze militias prior to making political reforms, while the militias wanted the reforms made before they disarmed. But first, I want to tell you about this video sponsor, Atlas VPN. The internet is an invaluable tool of modern researchers and historians. Whether you're finding sources or, for me, finding archival footage, it is indispensable. But spending all that time online, especially going into sketchy places doing research for some upcoming projects, there's always the possibility that your private information can be stolen. That's why I started using a VPN a few years ago, and Atlas VPN is a great choice. It can help stop ads and malware, help you find discounts and avoid price discrimination online, and it's available on an unlimited number of devices. Atlas VPN is also a great way to expand the value of your streaming library. Don't you hate the fact that you need like half a dozen streaming services or more to watch everything you want? Well, because licensing deals are different in every country, there are shows available on foreign versions of Netflix that aren't available here in the US. If you're a weeb like yours truly, then just open up Atlas VPN, switch it to Japan, and voila, you now have a ton of extra anime to watch, you degenerate. And you're in luck because viewers of this channel can get a huge discount on Atlas VPN by clicking the top link in the description or the link in the pinned comment. You can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.83 a month, and just because they're cool like that, they'll give you an additional 3 months for free. And you can try them out for free for 30 days, money back guarantee. But you better act quick because this deal is only available for a limited time. Thanks again to Atlas VPN for sponsoring this video and supporting Casual Historian. But for now, back to the history. Down in southern Lebanon, the Israelis and Southern Lebanon Army were fighting an insurgency of the local Shia population. On February 16th, a prominent Shia cleric, Sheikh Regeb Harb, was gunned down by SLA militiamen. The cleric had earlier predicted that he would die at the hand of the Israelis, and his assassination by the SLA was interpreted as a fulfillment of this prophecy. In revenge for Harb's death, Hezbollah orchestrated another suicide bombing of Israeli forces. Near Deir Kanan, a car bomb was driven between 2 Israeli personnel carriers, killing 6 soldiers. This was the first suicide bombing that Hezbollah took credit for. The war continued to grow unpopular in Israel because mandatory conscription ensured that every citizen of fighting age served a tour in Lebanon. They were shot at or hit by roadside bombs, never knowing when or where they might be attacked from. They would often indiscriminately fire into groves and orchards, hoping to scare off or take out an enemy before they could get killed. You see the change first of all in the eyes of the soldiers. It's a look that reminded me of the look in the eyes of American soldiers I saw in the final stages of Vietnam. It is the look of soldiers and officers who know that their chances of winning in Lebanon are less than 0. In Lebanon, you can see an army that has experienced firsthand how military might is rendered impotent. On top of the war going poorly, the economy was also dragging down the government of Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. 3 members of his governing coalition defected from the majority in order to vote with Labor in a vote of no confidence, which forced new elections to be called for in July of 1984. Prior to the election, Likud held 48 seats and Labor held 47, neither possessing a majority. After the election, Labor retained 44 seats to Likud's 41. This gave the Labor Party's leader, Shimon Peres, the right to form a governing coalition, but there weren't enough left-wing seats in the Knesset to form a government. So he and Shamir agreed to form a coalition between Labor and Likud. They agreed to split cabinet offices between the two parties for 4 years, and halfway through swapped prime ministers, with Peres serving from 1984 to 86 and Shamir taking over from 86 to 88. Peres had campaigned on ending Israel's occupation of Lebanon and insisted that Labor hold the prime ministership first so they could work on withdrawing from Lebanon, along with other foreign and Palestinian policy priorities. Back in Beirut, the ceasefire begins to break down in July. Fighting between the Druze and Lebanese forces happens again in the Shuf, and a rumor about the Saudi government not granting visas to Shias for the Hajj sparked violence in West Beirut between Shia and Sunni militias. In August of 1984, Pierre Gemayel, founder and leader of the Phalange Party, died at the age of 79, leaving Amin Gemayel to take over. He initiated a purge of its ranks, which created discontent among members of the Lebanese forces, who would begin to assert more independence. A standoff was brewing between the Lebanese army and the Druze militia, commanded by Walid Jumblat. He continued to refuse passage to the Lebanese army through any of its territory without Jumblat's political reforms being implemented. Amin Gemayel had to get aid from the Syrians to clear up the blockades set up by the Druze and Lebanese forces along the Beirut-Tripoli highway. So currently in the narrative, we have a civil war between Muslims and Christians around Beirut. We have the Shia fighting against the Israelis in the south. But there is another conflict overlapping these two going on that a lot of history books on this subject kind of ignore, and that is a civil war amongst the Palestinian exiles. Between late August and early September 1982, Yasser Arafat and the PLO were evacuated from Lebanon, or at least they were supposed to be, but obviously they weren't. Arafat and 8,500 PLO were evacuated, and they were distributed across a number of willing Arab countries, with Arafat relocating to the PLO's new headquarters in Tunisia. Some of them, however, made their way to Syria, and subsequently back into Lebanon. Arafat was afraid of the PLO getting split up between all these countries, because it risked him losing control over the organization, which was the only reason anyone on the international stage took him or the Palestinian cause seriously. Well, in northern Lebanon, a rival began to challenge him for control of the Palestinian exile community. Said al-Maraga was a captain in the Jordanian army who defected in 1970 to join the PLO. He builds up his own power base among the anti-Arafat factions, many of whom are now being supported by Assad. Fearing this rival might strip him of his power and recognition abroad, Arafat violates the agreement he made with the United States and returns to Lebanon in May of 1983, arriving in the port city of Tripoli. When he arrives, he announces the expulsion of al-Maraga from the PLO and rallies his supporters to his cause. Maraga is unfazed, as he brings his supporters along with him, consisting of the more secular leftist Palestinian factions, and organizes his own group, Fatah al-Intifada. On November 3, 1983, the fight between Arafat and Maraga in Tripoli entered its climactic confrontation. The remnants of the PLO, aided by a local Sunni militia and, quite ironically, receiving arms from the Phalangists, fight against Fatah al-Intifada and other anti-Arafat Palestinian groups, including both the Popular and Democratic Fronts for the Liberation of Palestine. Assad decided to tilt the odds in Maraga's favor by placing Syrian units on the anti-Arafat side. By November 26th, the Battle of Tripoli was over, and a ceasefire between the PLO and the Syrians was achieved. A second evacuation for Arafat and his followers would be conducted in December, delivering 4,700 of Arafat's loyalists to Algeria, North Yemen, Tunisia, Sudan, and Iraq. But by October of 1984, there were reports of the PLO beginning to rebuild their strength in West Beirut and within the Palestinian refugee camps south of the city. They were supported by Murra Batoun, a local Sunni militia. Amal and other Shia militias feared the return of the PLO, not only because of their own history with the group, but because they feared losing the power they had gained due to the PLO's absence. Meanwhile, Israel was trying to draw down its involvement in Lebanon. On January 14th, Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin submitted a plan for withdrawal of forces from Lebanon. The Likud members of the cabinet initially resisted, but the Likud Minister of Housing voted in support of the plan, allowing Rabin and Perez to move forward. It was a two-phased plan, the first of which called for building up the SLA's strength by recruiting additional members, increasing its arms budget, and building up its fortification infrastructure. The second phase was to pull back the IDF while dismantling the fortifications it had built up for its own use. The ultimate plan was to withdraw from all of Lebanon except for a strip of land along the border with Israel. It was basically reconstituting the good fence policy dating back to Rabin's government in the 1970s. The strip would be mainly patrolled by the SLA, with up to 1,000 IDF reinforcing them. The Israelis hoped that their withdrawal announcement would reduce the number of attacks, but they actually increased. The IDF had faced about 50 attacks a month throughout 1984, but in January and February of 1985, they nearly doubled. A pattern emerged. The IDF would be hit by some terror attack, and in retaliation they would blockade a Shia village. Troops would round up all the males of fighting age in the village and interrogate them while their homes were searched. Indeed, the gratuitous destruction, vandalism, and brutality meted out by the Israeli troops reflected their fear, resentment, and frustration. It was a cathartic lashing out against their unseen tormentors, the ghosts that flitted from wadi to wadi, orchard to orchard, silently plucking the lives of Israeli soldiers before disappearing once again. The first major withdrawal was from Sidon on February 16th. That same day, Hezbollah officially announced its existence in a press conference in West Beirut, where they published their manifesto in the form of an open letter, read by their spokesperson, Saeed Ibrahim Al-Amin, Amal's former representative to Iran. 2 days later, thousands of armed Hezbollah drove down to Sidon from West Beirut to hold a rally, claiming victory against the Israelis, calling Amin Jamal the Shah of Lebanon, and burning down bars and other establishments that went against their brand of radical Shia Islam. On March 2, 1985, the Israelis searched a Shia meeting hall in Maraka, based on tips from a local informant, but found nothing. 2 days later, a pair of Amal leaders, Mohammed Saad and Khalil Girardi, meet in the back room of the hall, when a bomb planted underneath a desk goes off. killing both of them. Local Amal forces round up and execute the informant, blaming the Israelis for the attack. However, the Israelis deny any involvement, claiming it was probably Hezbollah, who was increasingly aggressive not just toward the Israelis, but also towards its Shia rivals. Knowing what happens later, both of these stories are believable. In April 1985, the Israelis withdrew from Tyre and most of southeastern Lebanon. They also closed their prison camp in Ansar. It released 752 of its detainees, but transferred the remaining 1,167 to a new prison built in northern Israel at Atlit. The Israelis hoped to use the Shia detainees as a bargaining chip to acquire information on the safe return of missing Israeli servicemen. Instead, Hezbollah and other Shia terrorist groups would take more hostages of their own and demand the return of the detained Shia in Israel in exchange for the return of the new hostages. But, as stated earlier, Hezbollah never intended to return any soldier or state official they kidnapped. While the Israelis are dealing with Shia insurgents in the south, the Christians around Beirut are beginning to fracture. Back in February, Amin Gemayel had taken over control of the Lebanese front's finances, due to it and the Phalange being closely linked. To assert more independence, Samir Geja declared the front's independence from the Phalange. The ranks of the Phalange party were filled with wealthier Maronites, while the ranks of the Lebanese front had been filled with lower middle-class Maronites. Tensions between the poor and wealthy Maronites had been held at bay by charismatic figures like Pierre and Bashir Gemayel, but Amin was not up to the task. Another part of this schism had been fostered by the Syrians, who had agents infiltrate the Lebanese forces and encourage it to assert independence from the Phalange. But before we go any further into this story, I want to talk to you about this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the all-in-one learning platform with video courses where professionals will teach you step-by-step how to do something. It's especially good if you are looking to acquire a more technical skill like video editing. YouTube tutorials are great and everything, but they're real hit or miss. Skillshare, on the other hand, has a much higher floor when it comes to the quality of their tutorials. But Skillshare isn't just a streaming service, but a community as well, where you can ask the instructor questions and get feedback from them and other students. As you may have noticed from my last video, I've been having trouble with my videos getting demonetized and age restricted. So I checked out this course on how to get the most out of stock footage for visual storytelling. And if you're an aspiring content creator yourself, then I cannot recommend enough Jordy Vanderput's numerous courses on the Adobe Suite with programs like Premiere Pro and After Effects. And the great news is that they have a special offer for you. You can get a month of Skillshare Premium for free by clicking my affiliate link down in the description, in the pinned comment, or as what you can see right here into the address bar. By doing that, not only will you get a month of Skillshare Premium for free, but you'll also be supporting the channel, allowing me to make more videos about more niche subjects that you don't hear people talking about. And you can learn some amazing skills on Skillshare. Like, I was a customer of Skillshare long before they ever offered to sponsor me, and I cannot highly recommend this service enough. So thanks to Skillshare for supporting Casual Historian, but for now, let's get back to the history. Geja and his faction of the Lebanese forces attempted to bring the IDF, or Lebanese army, onto his side by provoking a fight with the Muslim militias of Sidon, but it backfired. Instead, Shia and Druze militia arrived to aid the Sunni militias. Geja was forced to sign a truce and migrate with a large number of Christian villagers in Sidon to the north, losing him authority amongst the Maronites. But this setback doesn't deter Geja. He tried to gain control of the group through an internal vote, but was beaten by Eli Hobeika, the officer who led the Lebanese front units into Sabra and Shatila after Bashir's assassination. Hobeika would try to gain full control of the Lebanese front himself by relocating those loyal to Amin Gemayel to isolated command posts. But in order to keep the Syrians off his back, he declared his commitment to Christian unity, national reconciliation, and that he would sever ties with the Israelis, shutting down its liaison office in Jerusalem. This managed to win Assad over. The bombing in Maracah may have drastically weakened the leadership of Amal in the south, but Assad's orders had done plenty of damage on its own. Under orders from Damascus, Amal had begun to attack the PLO and other Palestinians loyal to Arafat in West Beirut. This was known as the War on the Camps, which managed to defeat the PLO around Beirut, but it mortally wounded Amal. In May, they attacked the camps of Sabra, Shatila, and Burj al-Barajina. Amal was joined by Fatah al-Intifada in attacking the Palestinian camps around Beirut, who were loyal to Arafat. By June 2nd, Amal was able to completely overrun Sabra, but at a heavy price. The Palestinians made an alliance with the Druze, who allowed them into their ranks to fight back against Amal. By early June, the IDF had pulled out of Lebanon, except for the security zone along the border patrolled by the SLA, which was now led by Antoine Lahad since the death of Saad Haddad a year prior. Hezbollah and the Palestinians also fortified their own positions in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah would pick up the PLO's old habit of firing rockets indiscriminately into northern Israel, though not at the same rate prior to the Israeli invasion in 1982. Hezbollah began to construct bases and secret tunnels across southern Lebanon to hide weapons caches and escape routes. They also began to reorganize themselves, having both guerrilla fighters and a more conventional military arm. They organized local militias made up of part-time fighters, and while not fighting or training, these local militias would plaster their villages with Hezbollah and Iranian propaganda. They organized prayer sessions at local mosques and gave religious instruction, where they would indoctrinate and recruit. They would also attack or intimidate rival militant groups. Hezbollah created its own welfare programs in the areas it controlled, funded by Iran. They would also enforce their strict moral code of conduct in these areas. Between late 1984 and early 1985, more and more Americans would be kidnapped by Hezbollah and its various front groups. On March 8, 1985, a car bomb nearly killed Saeed Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, a Hezbollah leader, but one of his bodyguards, Jihad Mughniya, Imad Mughniya's brother, was killed. Hezbollah blamed the US for the attack, but the CIA denied all knowledge of it. Lebanese intelligence blamed the CIA's use of Mukafaha, a counterterrorism unit of the Lebanese military. The CIA did cooperate with Lebanese intelligence in order to free American hostages, funding the construction of an electronic signal station in exchange for funneling information back to the CIA. They were particularly interested in the IRGC barracks in Baalbek, where they believed William Buckley was being held. In May 1985, Shimon Peres met with Michael Leedon, a former US official with ties to the CIA. He came on behalf of Robert McFarlane, President Reagan's national security advisor. He wanted everything they talked about to be off the record, and to not be an official operation of either the CIA or Mossad. He wanted to get Israel's help in getting US hostages back. Peres briefed both Shamir and Rabin, who agreed to help the US. Behind the scenes, the Israelis weren't the only ones offering to help the Americans get hostages returned. Both Yasser Arafat and Hafez al-Assad were offering information or negotiations in order to win US favor. On June 14th, the Trans World Airlines Flight 847 is hijacked by Hezbollah terrorists shortly after takeoff from Athens, Greece. This operation was planned by Imad Mughniya, the mastermind of the Tyre base attack in 1982, as well as the bombing of the US Embassy and Marine Barracks in 1983. They demanded the release of all Shia prisoners the Israelis held in Atlit. During the negotiations, the plane was flown back and forth between Beirut and Algiers, with a handful of passengers being released at a time, thanks to Assad brokering the release of over 700 prisoners from Atlit. Around this time, Ronald Reagan's national security advisor, Rob McFarlane, uses contacts with the Israelis to begin back-channel negotiations with the Iranians, hoping they could get Hezbollah and their other proxies in Lebanon to release American hostages. So the accounts I've read dispute whether or not it was the Israelis that reached out to the Americans offering to connect them to the Iranians, or if the Americans reached out to Israelis asking them to connect it. But regardless of which it was, they both had an interest in getting hostages released from Iranian proxies. Frustration and fear that blinded the West in its attempts to deal with Khomeini's Iran, and with the new and ghastly phenomena of hostage-taking that took root in the Middle East in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. Iran's fingerprints could be found on almost every case of kidnapping in the region in the years that followed. The Iranians themselves, without batting an eyelid, would weave an elaborate tissue of lies, denying any connection with or even knowledge of the various hostage-taking episodes. Neither we nor the Americans were deceived. Now, I don't want this to turn into oops all Iran-Contra, because this subject is still hotly debated to this day, and I doubt we're gonna have a decisive resolution to it anytime soon. In his autobiography, Reagan claims one of the reasons for establishing contacts with Iran were rumors about the Ayatollah's health. He appeared to be circling the drain, and Reagan hoped that establishing ties with the moderates might place the US in a good position to reshape the regime after Khomeini's death. Everyone seemed to be under the opinion that the Islamic Republic was so dependent on Khomeini that it wouldn't survive his passing. We had also spent a great deal of time thinking about possible scenarios for Iran's future once Khomeini was gone. It didn't surprise me when I was told there were moderates in the government who wanted to out the tyrannical theocracy imposed on them by Khomeini and his cohorts. Therefore, Israel's offer to act as an intermediary and help us open a channel to Iran's potential future leaders seemed very interesting. I'll probably make my own video about Iran-Contra at some point in the future, but if you need more context about it right now, I suggest checking out Mr. Beat's video about it. Anyways, the grossly oversimplified version of the story is that the Americans would sell equipment to the Israelis, who would sell their American weapons to a private third party, who would then sell them to the Iranians. The money made from the Iranians would be funneled through some shell companies and eventually make their way to the Contras in Nicaragua. While the US was dealing with the hostage takers, the civil war continued on around Beirut. In June of 1985, the Damascus Plan was unveiled. Syrian troops would re-enter the parts of Lebanon where it had been expelled from years earlier in order to re-establish central authority, now that Amin Gemayel was more compliant to Syria's aims. He also halted the war in the camps that he had compelled Amal to wage months earlier. And, of course, another reconciliation conference would be held. By September of 1985, the reconciliation meeting had failed. After a decade of trying to negotiate an end to the fighting with the politicians, Assad changed tactics. If the politicians couldn't stop the fighting, maybe the militias could. He invited the heads of Amal, the Druze, and the Lebanese front to Damascus to hammer out a deal. In reality, Assad probably threatened them, and since he had them in Damascus, it wouldn't be difficult for them to never be seen again. Regardless of the nature of this meeting, they left with a draft of the Damascus Agreement. This new agreement called for the Lebanese army to withdraw from civilian areas of Lebanon and to be replaced by Syrian troops. The militias were ordered to be disarmed and disbanded. The constitution would be amended to abolish religious sectarianism in the government, and the size of parliament would increase from 99 to 142 seats, divided equally between Christians and Muslims. This agreement was unpopular with the Maronites, with both Amin Gemayel and Samir Geja allying together against it. This resulted in the Lebanese front splintering between those loyal to Hubeiqa and those loyal to Geja, and they would hash out these disagreements in the streets and suburbs of East Beirut. Former presidents Camille Chamoun and Suleiman Frangia also rejected the agreement, the two of them agreeing being even rarer than Gemayel and Geja. As fighting reignited around Beirut, Assad restarted the war on the camps to root out any PLO they had missed back in the spring, but they didn't enter the camps alone. Amal would enter the camps alongside the 6th Brigade of the Lebanese Army, which was predominantly Shia. The fighting, however, had inconclusive results. The PLO were allied with the Druze, who responded to the incursion by attacking Amal positions outside the camp with artillery fire from the Shuf. Just to make this more confusing, basically every side here, except the PLO, was being funded or armed by the Syrians. In December, the Druze began their shelling of East Beirut again in order to pressure the Maronite leadership to accept the Damascus Agreement, which was rewritten as the National Agreement to Solve the Lebanese Crisis, but was better known as the Tripartite Pact. This reform proposal called for the establishment of an upper house to parliament, the appointment of a new cabinet, and that all constitutional reforms were to be implemented within a year, which included the abolishment of sectarianism, reducing the votes needed to win the presidency from 2/3 to 55%, and that the president must approve a bill within 30 days when passed by parliament. The army was to be withdrawn from all the cities and reorganized to coordinate with the Syrian military, that Lebanon was to have a special relationship with Syria and defer to its lead in foreign, security, economic, and educational policy, and that Syria was to maintain its role and influence within Lebanon without being required to diplomatically recognize it. Most saw the Tripartite Pact for what it really was: Syrian domination of Lebanon. And aside from Hubeiqa's loyalists, most of the Christians ardently opposed it. In January of 1986, fighting broke out again between Geja and Hubeiqa's supporters. Hubeiqa's forces attacked President Gemayel's personal militia, 475, in the Gemayel estates of East Beirut. Gemayel and Geja would join forces to overpower Hubeiqa and force him to flee Beirut, causing the Tripartite Agreement to lose its only major Christian backing in the capital. But by February, the Syrians finally returned to Beirut after 3 years of absence. In September of 1986, Shimon Peres met with President Reagan in Washington, D.C., who had graciously thanked the outgoing prime minister for all the help he had given the U.S. in getting American hostages released from the Shia terrorists. But, according to Peres's autobiography, Reagan warned him that too much information about the operation was getting out. It never crossed my mind that North could have been working on his own, or that Shultz was not in the picture, or that Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, had his own very strongly conflicting position. I could not know that the authorizations that McFarland said he had were by no means as authoritative and representative as he claimed. On November 2, 1986, just 2 days before midterm elections, David Jacobson, an American hostage held in Lebanon by Hezbollah, was released. That same day, a magazine in Beirut, Al-Shira, published an article detailing the trip of Rob McFarland to Tehran and the sale of weapons to the Iranian regime. At this point, the secret funding of the Contras in Nicaragua had not yet been connected to the sale of arms to Iran, so initially the scandal was called Irangate. As I mentioned earlier, this video is not about Iran-Contra. That'll be a future video. In January of 1987, Amal would begin tackling the PLO problem away from Beirut, targeting their last stronghold near Sidon, in the camp of Magdusha. By the end of January, Amal had made the Shatila and Burj al-Barajina camps uninhabitable. The Druze, who were still sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, began to attack Amal positions in West Beirut. They were joined by other Syrian armed leftist factions such as the Progressive Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and the Syrian Social National Party. They fought against Amal and the 6th Brigade of the Lebanese Army for control of West Beirut, and nipping at Amal's heels from behind was Hezbollah. To save Amal from destruction, the Syrian army intervened, attacking the Druze, Palestinians, Communists, and the SSNP. In a somewhat anticlimactic moment, on May 21, 1987, the Cairo Pact, originally signed between Charles Halou, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Yasser Arafat in 1969, and arguably the ultimate cause of both the civil war and the Israeli invasion, was abrogated by the Lebanese parliament. The PLO no longer had free reign over Lebanon. Of course, this was ultimately meaningless, since the PLO was hardly a player in the politics of the Palestinians, much less that of Lebanon as a whole. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Amal continued its sieges of the Palestinian camps near Tyre in southern Lebanon, but Assad decided to end the campaign. At this point, not only was the PLO no longer a threat to his hegemony over Lebanon, but the constant massacres of Palestinians by Amal and other Syrian proxies was damaging Assad's reputation within the Arab world. Assad's feelings about the Palestinians weren't too far off from most other Arab leaders, being at best annoyed by Arafat and the PLO. But they and the Palestinian cause were still popular amongst Arab citizens, so a ceasefire was brokered, allowing the PLO to be evacuated from their camps and villages near Sidon. No longer needing to fight the Palestinians, Amal decided to strike back against Hezbollah, who had been chipping away at Amal's power for several years. And their first major victory was capturing Nabatea on April 7th. Hezbollah would counterattack in May, hitting Amal in southern Beirut, supported by Palestinian fighters in the nearby camps. Amal's leaders also discovered that their ranks had been infiltrated by Hezbollah. Syrian troops intervened to establish a ceasefire. Hezbollah threatened to kill its western hostages if Assad acted against them. Violence intensified. After negotiating with Hezbollah's representatives in Damascus, a ceasefire was achieved. The militias in West Beirut, except for Hezbollah, were to be disarmed, and that Lebanese security would replace the Syrians in southwest Beirut. Assad would restart his war against the PLO by encouraging the Palestine National Salvation Front to attack the Shatila and Burj al-Barajina camps. After a month of fighting, most of the civilian residents of Shatila had fled the camps, and the homes were destroyed. On July 8, 1988, a ceasefire allowed the remaining 175 PLO and their families to relocate to Sidon. When this was finished, the Syrians handed over control of southwestern Beirut to internal Lebanese security, in accordance with their agreement with Hezbollah, who redirected its forces towards Sidon to challenge Amal in that region. 1988 was an election year in Lebanon, and parliament was scheduled to elect a new president by September 23rd, who at this point was still required to be a Maronite. There were several candidates whose names were being thrown around. Former President Suleiman Frangia was being promoted by Assad, despite constitutional term limits. Along with Frangia, both Eli Hobeka and Samir Geja had presidential aspirations of their own. The most consequential aspirant, however, was General Michel Aoun, who saw himself in the same mold as Fouad Shahab, the Lebanese general who became president after the Lebanese Civil War back in 1958. Aoun was first and foremost a Lebanese nationalist rather than a pan-Arabist or Maronite supremacist, and he believed the military was the only institution that could create a unified Lebanon, and Lebanon couldn't be truly unified until the foreign occupiers were gone, and that meant Syria. Nobody believed that a fair election could be held so long as Syrian troops were occupying West Beirut. The first vote was scheduled for August 18th, and President Gemayel asked Aoun to orchestrate a boycott of the election by Christian MPs. If enough of them didn't show up, Parliament wouldn't have a quorum and therefore a vote couldn't happen. And Aoun was successful. The Syrians consolidated their position in West Beirut and planned on taking control of East Beirut before the presidential elections in September. However, the Maronites of East Beirut controlled too many economically vital areas to risk a full-on military assault due to the strength of the Lebanese front. They also held 25 of the 27 surviving Christian members of parliament. The alliance of Gaja's Lebanese front, President Gemayel, and the Lebanese military were outnumbered by the Syrians and their proxies, but they had sufficient firepower. The flow of arms from Israel to the Maronites had not stopped after their withdrawal in 1985. On top of Israeli aid to the Lebanese front, the Lebanese military began receiving arms from Baghdad. The Iran-Iraq War ended on August 16, 1988, and Saddam Hussein had been holding a grudge against Syria for siding with Iran, so they began to ship their excess arms to the Lebanese Christians as revenge. The Christian alliance with foreign backing was too powerful for Assad and its proxies, unless Assad was willing to engage in total war against the Christians. Foreign governments feared violence intensifying, especially if Parliament failed to elect a new president by September 23rd. The Vatican, the Soviet Union, and Saudi Arabia all feared a constitutional crisis in Lebanon and pressured the United States to resolve it. On September 13, 1988, U.S. diplomat Richard Murphy visited Damascus to hammer out a compromise. The U.S. rejected Frangia, but accepted Mikhal Dahir, a Maronite member of parliament. Murphy would bring this recommendation back to East Beirut. Gemayel, Gaja, and Patriarch Safir condemned this nominee. They believed that Dahir would be nothing but a Syrian puppet. Gemayel met with Assad in Damascus on September 21, 1988. Gemayel proposed that Dahir be elected as president for a transitional government until parliamentary elections could be held, and the reforms passed. But Aoun and Gaja made an alliance on that same day, reacting negatively to Gemayel's proposal. Syria was also suspicious. The vote scheduled for September 22nd didn't happen because Assad insisted it be held in West Beirut, his stronghold in the capital. At 10 p.m. September 22nd, 1988, President Gemayel asked General Aoun to set up a temporary military government. Prime Minister Haas argued that Gemayel's decree was unconstitutional and refused to recognize its legitimacy. Antoine Lahad of the SLA pledged his loyalty to this government, which led the Syrians to call it a Zionist project. As you guys remember from the previous video and possibly this video, I've not done editing it yet, so I have no idea how much I may or may not have to censor, but I've had some troubles with YouTube age restricting and monetizing videos. I want to give a quick thanks to all of my patrons, and in particular, I want to give special thanks to the most recent patrons, Uzume, CJ, Mike's Along, and Chris Recker. Thank to you guys and all of you who have been patrons for much longer than this. Your support allows me to keep making videos like this even when YouTube keeps messing with the channel, messing with the videos. YouTube's really cracked down in the last month on anything depicting violence, and well, it's hard to talk about conflict in the 20th century without talking about or depicting violence in some way, which is why a lot of footage ended up getting replaced with stock footage of puppies in the last video. Thank you guys so much for supporting this channel. It really means a lot to me. And of course, if you want to support this channel as well, supporting it through either Patreon, but you could also support it by checking out my affiliate link for Skillshare down in the description below. I cannot recommend that service highly enough. This isn't just me, shilling them because I get paid. It is a service that I legitimately use all the time. It's like whenever you see like a big jump in production quality in any of the videos on this channel, there is like a 99% chance that I just finished watching a course on Skillshare to help make that possible. So thanks to Skillshare for not only financially supporting this channel, but for giving me the skills to make even better videos. If you're somehow watching this video and you haven't seen the previous parts, this is the 5th part in a hopefully only 6-part series about the Lebanese Civil War. Go ahead and check out this video to see the first part of the series, or maybe check out this video that YouTube also thinks you'll like. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.